There are 13 10K resistors, and that will use up all the resistors. They may supply some extra. I'm not going to bother counting them. Here's all of the resistors installed. Now they're not soldered on the other side. Everything, well, at least the 10Ks are not soldered. And this is more leads than I would normally allow before I soldered them. It becomes too dense to fit the iron comfortably between the leads. These blocks, by the way, are made by this company, well, this company here. There is a crystal. The top is marked 11.0592 megahertz. It's non-polarized, but I like to have the writing read from left to right. And it should be noted that the parts inside this boxed area, this outline here, are going to be underneath the integrated circuit. So we want to make sure these components are as low or as close to the deck as we can get them. Kit contains some capacitors. Actually, we're only going to use 5 capacitors. These are marked 22, meaning 22 picofarad, and they're ceramic capacitors. These are marked 104, very small writing, and they're monolithic capacitors. These are also non-polarized, but I like to be able to read the writing. And these are installed this symbol here. It'll either say 22 or 104. Now the hole spacing's not quite right. I just work the capacitor down as low as I can. Tug on one leg to straighten it slightly. And that's what you get. I'm going to focus on it here. The 22 microfarad capacitors, that's these two, are laid down, so to speak. Remember I said this stuff all had to be fairly compact because we're going to put an integrated circuit on top of it. Now, they're shown here, but the reason you can see the socket is here, and they have to be contained within the socket. So here they are, all the resistors and all of the non-polarized capacitors are installed, and the non-polarized crystal. Here are the 104s, and here are the 22s. All of the components installed so far are non-polarized. They could be installed in either direction. From now moving forward, a lot of stuff is going to be polarized. I'll distinguish that as I move ahead. This step wants to install the, there's two of them, 100 microfarad filter capacitors. Now these are electrolytic capacitors, and they're marked 100 microfarad, 25 volts. They have a white band sort of with arrows on it. That's the negative side of the capacitor, and that's the short lead. The positive side of the capacitor is not really marked, but it has a long lead. Short lead, long lead. White mark. The silk screening on the board is marked plus minus. Has a fairly long rectangular outline, and one side, the negative, is a white mark. These capacitors are going to install with the long lead positive, the short lead negative, with the white side of the capacitor matching the white side of the silk screen, but they're going to lay over. So make sure you lay them over before they're soldered. Otherwise you won't have enough lead length. So let's see, we're going to lay them over first and then move the leads to hold it in place. There's two of them. We'll install them the same way. Try to keep them in their box because there's going to be a switch installed here. The sockets, well, here's the 8-pin socket. I mean, you can tell it's got 8 pins. The socket has a notch at one end. A little notch there. This end is smooth. A little notch. That notch is indicated on the silk screening as being this side. So we want to put the notches lined up. And if the pins are not bent, it should just fall in place. With sockets, I like to bend the two of the diagonally opposite pins over. Now the big socket was already mounted in the foam. The ICs are on the other side. Has a notch at one end. Silk screen shows the notch here. Do exactly the same thing. Lay it in there. Bend over two diagonally opposite pins. So I'll bend over this pin and this pin. Might be a good place to use the reverse acting tweezers. We do want to hold those capacitors flush against the upper surface of the board. Now on the sockets, take the two diagonally opposite pins that I bent over and we'll solder them. And where's the 8-pin socket? Here it is. So this one's bent over, and this one's bent over. It's interesting to note that pin 1, which would be this one here, on the 8-pin socket, which is this pin right here, which is square. See, all the rest of the holes are round. So they've designated pin 1 on this socket, but they didn't do it on this socket. It's sort of interesting. The capacitors are completely soldered. We'll cut the leads off. The sockets have 2 pins on each socket, but they're loose. So what I'm going to do is take my heat membrane, which is a paper towel, and see that one's been soldered. I'm going to position my fingers so I can push the socket and the board tightly together after I melt the joint, not before. I'll probably hear a click here. Camera probably didn't pick it up. That ensures that the socket is laying tight against the circuit board. I'll do the same thing to the 8-pin socket. Squeeze until I've melted the solder. Okay. Now it's just a simple matter of completing all the solder joints. It'll take a lot of heat. The pins are not very big. And since we're playing with a socket and not the actual IC, I'll just measure. I can just move along sequentially and solder them. If I had an actual IC installed here, I'd skip around and try to spread the heat. Maybe do every other side or every 4th leg or something. You may want to inspect the joints with a glass to verify that they're actually soldered. And there's no solder bridges. Now understand that the sockets themselves are not polarized, but the integrated circuit is. So while the notch in the silk screen and the notch we'll see on the integrated circuit have to be lined up, the socket could be installed the wrong way. Now these are polarized and they cannot be reversed. Well, they shouldn't be reversed. The next thing we have are a couple of single inline pin, in case you've never run across that notation. Single inline pin devices. and they are these. And they are polarized by a notch or a curve. We'll show it close up here. These are identified with a notch on one end. And they show the notches as being opposing, or this way. There's also a notch or a bevel the whole way along the front. That's not what they're indicating. They're looking for this notch on the end. And it's indicated by a square solder pad. Pull this out. See that square pad and a square pad here. So the notches will go facing the square pad. I don't know why that won't fit, but that's how they'll be installed. And these are actually level measuring devices that drive LEDs. So the input audio and power to it, and I think each one drives 4 or 5 LEDs, and they light sequentially as the volume gets louder. Maybe they'll just stay in there. Alright, they look pretty vertical. Go ahead and solder the rest of the pins.